my lovely little gemstones, it's Afira, and today I'm going to be reading A Game of Ice, Chapter 4, written by Coconut Cluster. This chapter has warnings for disturbing imagery, mentions of blood, fainting and drowning, and panic attacks. Chapter 4, Evil Die and Good Endure. There was no sun visible in the sky as they moved forward. There were no beams escaping from the thick clouds overhead, no warmth seeping through their heavy grayness, nothing to indicate that the sun hadn't, without reason or warning, disappeared completely. If Logan didn't know better, he might believe it had done exactly that. But he did, in fact, know better, even if Remus's unique thought process bordered on absurdist more often than not. Still, sun or not, or something even wilder, a chill permeated the air as he and the others made their way further through the forest, and Logan forced down a shiver more than once. The ground sloped gradually, almost subtle enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. Logan was paying very close attention, and noticed it as soon as Patton began tripping more on the various natural debris scattered across the forest floor. He never was too coordinated, Logan thought with a small breath of a laugh to himself each time he had to study the moral side yet again. The treetops seemed to raise, tower over them even more as they descended. A murmur of a stream echoed somewhere within the dense forestry that flanked their dirt path, though something about it seemed rough, like bits of metal scraping against stone with the water's current. Logan had the urge to find the stream and investigate the noise, but he had more common sense than to fall prey to Remus's odd world-building. To the path he'd stick, however dry and uninteresting that was. My feet hurt, Patton mumbled at his side, right before stumbling over yet another unidentifiable mass on the ground. Logan's hand shot out to steady him as Deceit shot a dry look over his shoulder. We've only been walking for an hour, the snake-faced side said with a roll of his mismatched eyes, duly ignoring both Logan and Virgil's glares. He leveled his gaze on Patton and raised an eyebrow. Maybe Logan will give you a piggyback ride. Patton pursed his lips, training his gaze on the ground as Logan helped him straighten up, though he didn't let go of the logical side's hand immediately. Thank you, he said quietly, and let go. It's no problem, Patton. Don't let him get you down. Patton didn't respond, just nodded. Logan sent Deceit a furtive glance in the corner of his eyes. He's just cranky. I am not! Patton, and Virgil for that matter, though Logan wasn't surprised, choked on a laugh as Deceit scoffed, the non-scaly side of his face turning an indignant pink and gloved hands curled into fists at his sides, making him look more petulant than intimidating. The grateful look that Patton gave Logan, blue eyes sparkling with delight once more behind his glasses, made something in Logan's chest stutter. He'd have to look that up when they got back to the mindscape. Heart murmurs couldn't be healthy, especially in times of stress such as these. After a brief pause for Deceit to stammer a rebuttal, which achieved approximately nothing, save for making Virgil snicker more, they continued their trek down the shadowed path. They'd mostly been quiet on their journey, a personal conversation occupying each of their thoughts, filling their heads and leaving no room for small talk. Occasionally, Logan heard Virgil muttering to himself, caught Roman's name in his murmurs a few times, and Patton hummed the same section of some song whenever they'd been completely silent for too long. The only person who'd been as quiet as the logical side was Deceit, whose eyes seemed almost glazed over as he stared at nothing in particular while they walked, biting the inside of his cheek lost in thought. Logan thought about asking what he was contemplating a few times, but he always waved the idea away in the end. Deceit would just as likely lie as he would jeer, and Logan wasn't keen on being slighted at the moment. The crunching of leaves underfoot filled their silence instead. A blur of motion in the trees to the left caught his eye. He didn't look over, just kept his gaze trained on the bit of path a few feet ahead, as he'd learned to do in their hour of navigating the forest. The blur slowed, then disappeared completely, fading as quickly as it appeared. He still didn't look over. A different noise reached his ears suddenly. He glanced over, but Patton wasn't humming, just looking around the forest idly as they walked. Logan stopped and listened closer, squinting at nothing as he picked apart what he was hearing. It was quick, continuous, but there was a spine-tingling discomfort to the sound, like metal scraping against stone. The stream's sharp babble had indeed switched directions, coming from further down the path instead of the shroud of trees around them. It seemed stronger, louder too. Logan had just begun to wonder what else he'd misinterpreted in his earlier observations when Virgil stopped in his tracks, ever vigilant. Do you hear that? He asked, voice hushed as he met Logan's eyes. Deceit and Patton both paused to look between them. What? Said Patton after a moment, looking around wildly before turning back to them, wringing his wrists. Logan resisted the inexplicable urge to take his hand. Is something wrong? Virgil shook his head almost imperceptibly, as if he was afraid to commit to the answer, and he bit his lip, glancing into the distance of the path. Water, he mumbled, mainly to himself. A river. A river? Logan repeated incredulously. He didn't think it was that loud. Then again, he'd thought it was far off to their left, too. A part of him, a much more reasonable and astute part of him, redundant as it sounded, broke through suddenly. It whispered, "It was. Of course. Why wouldn't Remus move things around to make their journey harder? He'd manipulated the tree branches before revealing that unnatural spider creature. Logan wanted nothing more than to knock him off that tree branch when he heard Patton choke a strangled cry. And though moving and enlarging a stream was a bit more drastic, he had no doubt the farcical side would go to such lengths, if only, or maybe specifically, to inconvenience them. A river, then. All right. Ahead. Virgil nodded down the path. He curled his fingers into his palms, ready to bolt at any noise, when his arm brushed against the hilt at his side. He looked down with a start, staring at the sword as if he'd never seen it before, which he probably hadn't. Without a word, he pulled it from its sheath and blinked at the blade, then looked back at Logan and Patton, a gleam in his eyes that said, "Might as well," as he gave a firm nod and turned to face the rest of the path. Deceit just rolled his eyes again, but Logan saw his gaze flicker to the sheath at his own waist. They continued forward, tension weighing down the already heavy air as they listened for the current to rush louder in their ears. The chill in the forest seemed stronger here, heading into the valley. Logan was glad for his long-sleeved outfit, ridiculous and fantastical as it was, with silver embroidery on the edges of its sleeves and odd, capelet-like piece over the shirt. At least he maintained some semblance of warmth, if not dignity. When he first saw the ensemble upon entering the imagination, he had the inexplicable urge to roll his eyes and berate Roman for such unnecessary theatrics. His breathing hitched when he went to speak and saw the Duke in his peripheral instead, black and green and egregiously sparkly in place of Roman's stately red and gold. Upon further inspection of his mage-esque outfit, Logan decided that anything Roman came up with would have been far more tasteful. At least Remus kept his dark blue palette. He still sorely missed his tie, though. He was too caught up in his thoughts to notice the others had stopped and ran directly into Patton. The Moralside wrapped an arm around his waist with a startled yelp as he stumbled back, dimples whittling themselves into his cheeks as he grinned at Logan, delighted in having their roles reversed since they'd started their trek into the forest. Logan felt heat creep onto his face. He really needed to check a medical guide when they got back from this godforsaken journey. "Would you two stop gazing into each other's eyes for 10 seconds? We have a situation here." Logan sent a scathing glare in Deceit's direction, but it withered when he saw the situation being had. The river they'd heard stretched out before them now, frothing with rapids that crashed against jagged rocks in the current. Hundreds of glints hit Logan's eyes despite the lack of sun. There were small pieces of something in the water, something sharp and metallic, causing those discordant cries as they struck each other and the stones, rising from the river like drowned screams. Any life beneath the water's surface was long since torn apart, and Logan knew, with a twinge of distaste in his chest, that they were no doubt the next intended victims. The beds were too far apart to leap across. He wasn't sure he wanted to risk it anyway, so they had to find another way to cross without braving the keen rapids. Virgil put his sword away as wordlessly as he unsheathed it. "How," he said slowly, "are we supposed to cross that?" "We need a bridge," sighed Deceit. He'd managed to seem more inconvenienced than distressed by everything in their journey so far, and quite honestly, Logan envied it. He'd get a headache from stress at this rate. "You don't say," Virgil snapped. "Now that you mention it, let me just pull out my patented pocket bridge. We'll be across in a jiffy thanks to your remarkable observation. Thank you, Deceit. Whatever could we do without you?" Jesus Christ. "There's no need to panic," Logan broke in before Virgil could push Deceit into the river, placing a hand on the anxious side's armored shoulder. "Look, there's a fallen tree further down." It was gnarled at the root and rotting at its top end, but it looked sturdy enough in the center, at least from where they stood a few meters away. Virgil released a minuscule breath. "We'll align it better on our end and use it as a bridge." Virgil nodded and crossed his arms, sobered enough to ignore Deceit as he scowled and stalked off towards the tree, though the anxious side trailed after him. Logan went to follow, but a hand landed on his arm, tentative but firm. He glanced back to see a frown on Patton's face. "Logan?" the Moralside said, quiet enough that Virgil and Deceit couldn't hear. "Are you sure we can cross that?" He peeked around Logan, eyeing the tree, lips pressed tightly together as Virgil and Deceit grumbled something at each other and sent to scooching the base to the left. Is it safe, I mean?" Logan looked between him and the tree, eyebrows furrowed. "I believe so." Patton's grip tightened on his arm, and Logan placed his hand on top of the Moralside's as if on instinct. "It's a wide trunk, Patton, I assure you. The chances of falling in are slim. I wouldn't suggest it if there was a safer option." Patton met his eyes again, frown fading slowly but surely into a small smile. "I know. I just wanted to make sure." He straightened up, brightening as he shifted his hand to lace his fingers with Logan's. "I trust you." Another wave of heat crept up Logan's neck as he stared at the link. He felt a bit faint, especially as Patton started humming to himself and tugged the logical side behind him, as he headed to where Virgil and Deceit were moving the tree inch by inch. He really was going to have a health crisis in this place, what between all the heart stammering and feverish blushes. He was inexplicably disappointed when Patton let go of his hand to help move the tree. Working together, if you could call Virgil and Deceit's bickering that, they were able to straighten the makeshift bridge in just a few minutes, though Patton had to stop and take a breather a few times when he saw odd little bugs skittering in and out of gaps in the tree's trunk. The tree was, thankfully, wide enough to make a decent platform for walking across, wide enough that Logan was cautious only for the sake of vigilance. "So," Deceit started slowly, arms crossed as he surveyed the bridge, "who's going first?" No one responded. Virgil and Patton were suddenly very interested in the pair of small burlap sacks hanging from Patton's belt, until Deceit just rolled his eyes, brushing his cape back and stepping onto the tree, muttering acerbic commentary under his breath as he set to teetering across the river. "Flipping useless," Logan heard the snake-faced side say clearly, just before he was out of earshot over the raging rapids. He made it across, though, hopping deftly over the mud on the opposite bed and turning to stare at them, expectant and unimpressed. Logan examined the tree again, trying to figure out whether he or Patton should go next. He didn't want to risk Patton going alone, but leaving Virgil for last would hardly end well. "I'll go," Virgil said. Logan and Patton looked over, surprised, and Patton reached a hand out, but Virgil shook his head. "I'm fine. I can do this." He set off without waiting for them to protest. Logan finally realized, as the anxious side passed him, what Virgil had been muttering to himself this whole time. "For Roman." He stepped onto the trunk, testing its strength with one foot before tentatively shuffling forward, arms spread wide like wings. He took it one step at a time, pausing in the middle. Logan saw his chest heaving with forced, deep breaths, watched him curl his fingers into his palms as he surged forward, eyes trained on a spot of the trunk a few feet away. He managed to make it just over halfway without incident. A clang of metal against metal rose from the water suddenly, its screech licking the bridge like fire, and Virgil flinched. His foot caught on something, a stray piece of bark or some odd creature that had burst onto his path, and he stumbled with its sudden stop, his complexion going ashen. His face pinched with effort as he struggled to regain his shaky balance. Logan noticed then just how high the froth of the rapids flew as they tumbled past rocks, and although 3 pairs of eyes were wide as spectators, the only screams ringing from the forest plummeted down from the ebony birds that combed the gray sky above their heads. Patton sucked in a breath and held it. The fear in Virgil's eyes hardened to something sharp, something fierce. He pulled his arms in and pushed forward with a rush of steps that lifted above the debris of their mortified bridge, the tread of his boots nearly imperceptible against its blackened bark. His momentum carried him, sending him rolling off the tree at its end and onto safe ground on the other side of the river. Patton cheered when Virgil stood and gave a thumbs up, face alight with a wide grin. "We don't have all day," mirroring the glare Virgil gave him afterwards, though Logan was sure he saw pride twinkle in his eyes when the anxious side turned back to the pair on the other side of the water. Logan shook himself back to attention and steeled his focus on the bridge ahead. Deceit had a point. Roman didn't have all day, so they didn't either. "You go, Patton," Logan insisted. Patton looked hurt for a split second, but it softened with a logical side explained. "That way I'll be behind you, in the possible event that you stumble." "Oh, well..." He took a breath as if to steel himself. "Off I go, then." He smiled, but Logan saw the nerves behind it. He offered what he hoped was an encouraging smile back. "You'll be fine, Patton." Patton stared at him a moment, round eyes unreadable, and nodded, striding to the tree without another word. He stepped up onto it, arms wide like Virgil's were, and Logan wasted no time boarding behind him. The river was somehow more intimidating from above. Logan could see the pieces surging below the water more clearly now. They were shreds of metal, scrap, as if someone had pulled the pieces together for construction and promptly been swept away by a storm. That was an analogy made uncomfortably feasible when the foam cleared on the river's surface, revealing shadows that looked far too similar to body parts for Logan's comfort, scattered across its floor. At least the water was shallow. Not that it would matter much, should they fall in. Patton let out a wheezing cry as a trail of beetles marched around from the underside of the trunk, their shiny shells painted a sickly green and legs too long for their bodies. They pulled themselves over the bark more than crawled, really, reaching out a spindly limb and then another, digging into the crevices of the tree and scraping along the trunk like a dying man searching for a drop of water in the desert. Logan resisted the urge to step on them and put them out of their misery. He had to maintain focus on crossing, not fostering humanity for the inhumane and technically unreal. He and Patton were halfway across when a voice breathed, just beside Logan's ear. "Have you ever wondered what it feels like to drown?" Logan stiffened, grabbing Patton's waist instinctively when the immoral side glanced back with a confused frown and promptly shrieked, startling himself off balance. Remus burst out laughing from behind Logan, a grating sound that would have made Logan wince if he cared. The logical side didn't dare look back, but the murderous looks on Virgil and Deceit's faces were enough to tell him that he didn't have to. Remus, he greeted dryly. I hear, Remus continued through his laughter, ignoring the logical side. It feels like your windpipe is tearing. He clapped, giddy, and Logan could see the stupid grin on his face without even looking at him. Isn't that an image? Patton gave a discomforted whine, and Virgil put a hand to his throat, face pinched with a grimace. Logan had half a mind to reel back and knock Remus into the river. He would, if he didn't know Remus would take him down too, and Patton with them. Why don't you do us a favor and find out? He said instead, nudging Patton forward, hands still in the moral side's waist as they crept on. Deceit smothered a laugh, though Virgil still looked disturbed at the windpipe comment. Patton stumbled back again a moment later as Remus appeared in front of them. His face was split by a teeth-baring grin, hands on his hips. He looked right past the stammering moral side to Logan. Logan, the Duke said, sardonic awe seeping into his voice. I didn't know you had some sass in you. He disappeared again and was back behind the logical side, resting his arm casually on Logan's shoulder and leaning in as if to share a secret with him. Normally, I'd shove you in the river for disrespecting such a generous game master as myself. Patton glanced back at him with wide, horror-stricken eyes. But frankly, I admire your moxie, so I'll let it slide this time. Next time, though. Back in front, Logan would get dizzy if he kept having to turn around and back. As Remus sighed, a smile on his face that made Logan want to take a shower or 12. You'll have to make it up to me. Let them pass, Remus, for God's sake. Deceit interrupted, a single eyebrow raised. Remus sucked in a breath, forcing it out slowly before he glanced back at the snake-faced side, who gave a look that reminded Logan of a snarky teenager. I have no problem pushing you in, my slithering sweetheart, Remus snapped. Make no mistake. Deceit just rolled his eyes. Again, Logan wasn't sure how he didn't have any vision problems at this point. Remus turned back to the pair still balanced haphazardly on the tree trunk, shaking his head as if to realign himself. He went quiet for a moment, staring at the water below, lost in thought. Patton glanced back at Logan with a frown, then startled when Remus let out a dramatic groan. Well, I've just been rudely interrupted, and I don't think I can simply carry on from where I was. My gusto is missing. I had a whole speech planned, a show prepared for you lot, and now... He sighed. How disappointing. Do watch your step there, Logan. I wouldn't want you to get torn to shreds before you owe me that favor. He winked and grinned, giving a fluttery wave right before he disappeared. Deceit stared at the now empty spot as they all fell silent, his expression flat with annoyance, and shook his head. Absolutely pointless. Logan forced a deep breath in and out of his lungs. Pointless indeed. Looking past Patton, he realized with a start that he had yet to let go of the moral side's waist, and, in fact, Patton had placed his own hands on top of Logan's, holding on like his life depended on it. Which it somewhat did. He saw that they had only a few yards to go. He leaned forward and told Patton, Keep going, we're almost there. Patton jumped again, and Logan could have sworn the moral side's face went bright pink. He waved the notion away as Patton started forward, tongue peeking out between his lips as he concentrated on the steps. Logan smothered a smile, falling into a river full of razor-sharp scraps because he got distracted by such a simple gesture, endearing as it was, would be more than a little bit out of character for him. He'd also be dead. That wasn't exactly ideal. They finally reached the opposite side of the river. Patton looked ready to collapse with relief, a half-hearted, crooked smile on his face as he looked back at Logan, though it faded slightly when the logical side finally let go of his waist. I told you you'd be fine, said Logan, offering the moral side a small smile in return. Patton tilted his head to the side. I know, he beamed. I believed you. Jesus Christ, are they always like this? Deceit muttered to Virgil, who gave a half-hearted glare. Deceit made a face at him and straightened his cape with a sniff. Logan's glare was far more than half-hearted. Let's get going, he said, straightening up and wiping debris from his clothes. The dirt path picked up seamlessly on the other side of the rapids, and in the crux of the valley they could no longer see just how far they had to the tower. To Roman. The sooner they continued, the better, especially if Remus was keen on interrupting them again. Virgil grimaced at the river as it gave a tumultuous crash again. Please. Somehow, someway, the further they went past the river, the worse their surroundings got. What had been dead trees and discomforting shadows at the start of their journey quickly turned to drooping trunks dipped in the shadows themselves, shrouded in inky blackness that seemed to seep onto the shoddy dirt path and swirl around their feet. Thick tendrils covered in thorns spread from somewhere behind the tree line. They were odd, purple and misshapen and constantly shifting, reaching out like outstretched arms that grasped only at air as the travelers they grabbed at veered away again and again. The birds that had been circling in the sky for over an hour swooped now, razor-sharp beaks pointed towards the ground and oily wings spread wide. Logan, when the group paused momentarily to rest their feet, glanced up at the avians as they dove towards the treetops. Where he expected to find beady, gleaming eyes, there was only empty space. He didn't look at them again. Ugh, it's cold down here, Virgil huffed, crossing his arms tighter over his chest as another chill swept towards them from beyond. He glanced down at his outfit, face drawn, and added quietly, almost to himself, I miss my hoodie. Deceit tugged at the edges of his cloak around his arms and scoffed. Send a formal complaint to Remus. I'm sure he'll accommodate you. Ready for another argument, Logan was pleasantly surprised when Virgil just snorted. Yeah, the anxious side said. Can you imagine? Dear Remus, he started in a cheery voice that reminded Logan of a customer service representative. As much as I enjoy the nightmarish landscape of your exceptional mind, the chainmail you provided me was below my usual standards. Please consider a replacement and send it as soon as possible, or I'll have to review poorly, you understand. Love, Virgil, Deceit finished, and they both broke into a fit of laughter. Logan watched quietly, contentedly, as they continued to make fun of Remus together, an easy conversationalism passing between them like old friends. He looked over at the sound of a sigh. Patton's face was alight with a soft smile as he, too, watched the pair, fingers laced together in front of him and bouncing with his steps. He bobbed his head side to side with some melody, probably the one he kept humming under his breath intermittently, and shifted his shoulders, clearly fighting off a shiver in the skin-tingling breeze. He caught Logan's eye and his smile brightened. I like seeing them get along, he whispered so only Logan could hear him, gaze trailing after Deceit and Virgil again. I know they have a lot to figure out, but I can tell they still care about each other, even if they argue a lot. Like Virgil does with Roman. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but still. He turned those round eyes, filled with curiosity and something else, something twinkling on Logan, and tilted his head to the side. You know when you care so much about someone that it doesn't really matter what they've done? You'll do anything to help them when they need it? Logan stared back, blinking a few times before he answered, slowly. I suppose. I don't know, he should have said. Should have been honest when told Patton that the thought of such intense emotions made his chest constrict a bit, because he didn't quite know, or even understand for that matter. But he didn't say that. The thought of admitting it made his chest constrict more than just a bit. I think that's how they are, Patton continued, oblivious to the tight-lipped conflict unfolding at his side. They're angry and hurt, I think, but they do anything to save each other in the end. Virgil said something in an overly nasal voice, undoubtedly a bad impression of Remus, that made Deceit double over with a laugh. A raucous but jovial noise that filled the silence of the forest with something bright, unafraid against the looming tension of the trees and whatever hid behind them. Deceit being a sunny forest in the shadowed valley was not something Logan could say he expected, but the small, proud smile on Virgil's face was enough for him to just breathe and accept it. I think you may be right, Logan said gently. He didn't want to be callous, ruin the moment as he was prone to doing, so he kept his voice low. The smallest of fond smiles still tugged at his lips. There was a moment of silence at his side. He glanced over and found Patton watching him, brow raised and eyes shining. What? The logical side asked. Patton's smile brightened as he shook his head, training his gaze back on the path ahead of them with a tiny sigh, though he didn't seem troubled by it. Nothing, he said breezily. Just thinking. Logan watched him for another second, but when the moral side just began humming to himself again, he faced forward as well, his smile inexplicably brighter. And then, just as he had countless other times today, he ran straight into someone. That someone was Virgil, who had, in Logan's defense, stopped suddenly and directly in the middle of the path. The light laughter he'd shared with Deceit faded into the buzzing silence of the forest, and Logan realized, just as a canary far into the coal mine, that Patton's song had stopped. Remus sat in the middle of the path, farther down from the group he'd effectively blocked, crisscrossed with his hands resting on his knees and eyes closed, almost serenely, if only his face weren't so naturally unhinged. He looked like he was meditating, though his posture was terrible. He didn't open his eyes as the four sides before him all slowed to a still, but his lips curled into a shadow of a smile. This is why we can never just enjoy things, Deceit muttered sourly, crossing his arms over his chest. Remus peeked one shadowed eye open to look at them, and his face split into a wide grin as he opened his arms in welcome. You're all alive, he cheered. How wonderful! I'm so glad my little creek diversion didn't trouble you all too much. He glanced around at their disbelieving faces and gave a strident laugh. Oh, I know. You all know me too well. I really wanted to see what would happen if someone fell in. No matter, though. I can always imagine up some sucker to tumble in another day. That's not what we're here for, though, he continued, closing his eyes again, wide smile remaining to paint a deranged expression across his face. It's time for another fun challenge. But first, let's all relax. It's been a stressful hour for all of us. Deceit scoffed. So let's take a moment to close our eyes and take a few deep breaths. No falling asleep on me, though. Nap time isn't until later. Is he making any sense to you guys? Virgil muttered to Logan and Patton, eyebrows drawn together as he kept a wary eye on the Duke, still meditating on the ground. Patton shook his head, but Logan just sighed. Does he ever? I said, take a few deep breaths, Remus repeated loudly, opening his eyes to a narrowed glare until everyone followed the instruction, shoulders rising and sinking with deliberate breathing. Remus smiled again. Thank you. I can feel the tension slipping away already. I had a lovely challenge prepared for one of you earlier, he said after a moment of exhale-filled quiet. The river was not merely an experiment for my own delight and amusement, although believe me, I was thoroughly delighted and amused, but a test, a trial of bravery and balance. He nodded his head side to side, an odd little dance to himself as he recalled the events. But once I arrived, I saw something absolutely inspiring, and I realized I had a better challenge to be given, if I could be a little more patient. He peeked one eye open and said, I am a very patient person, then waited, daring someone to object. When the forest remained silent, he hummed happily, satisfied, and went back to monologuing. So here I am. I've been preparing some things on the side, so unfortunately Roman has been alone for quite a bit longer than usual, and we'll have to make this quick, you understand. Virgil looked up instinctively, and though the tower was no longer visible over the trees, his face darkened. Guys, Patton said quietly. Deceit shushed him with a hiss, a warning to let Remus finish first, lest they all deal with the consequences. I think you'll all enjoy this one, the Duke continued, nodding brightly. A very popular one. I'm sure Roman would have requested it if he could. Virgil and Deceit both seemed suspicious at that, though Virgil looked more ready to claw Remus's face off than ask questions. Logan just pressed his lips tightly together, watching Remus closely. He was zanier than usual, but somehow subdued, and it raised the hairs on the back of Logan's neck. Guys, Patton repeated. It's actually one of my personal favorite fairy tales, Remus confided, eyebrows raised conspiratorially. Disney went all family-friendly with it. No wonder my brother loves it. But the villain, oh, the villain. What a wonderful design choice. Black and green motif. He sniffed with his nose in the air. Very well chosen. Logan, Patton whispered, curling his fingers into the sleeve of Logan's shirt. The logical side glanced over at him quickly, trying to maintain watch on Remus, but his gaze fell back to the moral side almost immediately. Patton looked dazed and frightened, blinking fast as if struggling to clear his vision, and he swallowed with an audible click in his Adam's apple. Logan mumbled his name, but Patton squeezed his eyes shut and swallowed again as his grip on Logan's sleeve tightened. Roman preaches love in fairy tales, Remus said evenly, but to me, it's about attention and priority. They never did get all the spinning wheels, did they? And Logan finally noticed too late. Patton was on the outside edge of their cluster, and at the same level as his fingertips, reaching out from within the trees like a hand grasping for another to hold onto, was a tendril of purple thorns, curled just right to present one single spike for pricking, its own natural spindle. Patton slurred, eyes still squeezed shut. I'm gonna pass out now. With a startled cry from Virgil and a string of curses from Deceit, Patton crumbled. Logan dove to catch him before he hit the ground, arms around the moral side's waist, Patton's head resting limply against the logical side's chest as Logan kneeled down beneath him. Now, Patton, I told you no sleeping just yet, Remus hissed, completely at ease as panic crashed over the eerie calm of the forest. Now nap time is ruined for the rest of us. Deceit took a step back, looking slightly green. Remus, this... You already gave Patton a challenge, Virgil screeched, eyes wide in horror as he stared at Patton's motionless figure, which Logan still held in his arms as he felt for a pulse and tried to at least seem calm. The anxious side made frantic gestures, signing something close to spider before it devolved into curling his fists into his palms and waving those around instead. You said one each! Remus's expression hadn't moved from its nearly blank smile. It's not for Patton, silly Virgil. He's asleep. He paused, tilting his head to the side and tracing Patton's calm, freckled features with those wild eyes. Do you ever wonder what it's like to die in your sleep? Do you think the dying can feel that they're dying while unconscious? Maybe it happens in a dream. Have you ever dreamt you're falling? Shut it, Remus. Logan snapped, his voice thankfully steady despite the pounding in his chest and pressure behind his eyes, and the Duke pursed his lips. You'd better explain yourself and explain yourself well right the hell now. Or what, Logan? You'll quote Aristotle at me? Remus gave a pitying laugh. I'm quaking. Truly, you don't think you can threaten me in my own land? My domain, Logan? Logan stared as Remus kept guffawing. This whole ordeal, Roman missing and now Patton something, asleep or something worse that Logan would not humor, wouldn't even consider. It was all Remus's fault. Moves in his own deranged game of chess, and he had the audacity to laugh at Logan. To laugh at logic. A familiar wave of heat flooded the logical side's senses, white-hot and blinding and oh so painful in his chest. The hand that had found Patton's pulse fell to the dusty ground and curled around something hard, a rock or a piece of the unknown debris. It bit into his palm, but he didn't care, because the minute he picked it up, he launched it straight at Remus's head. The force fell deathly still as it collided with the Duke. It met his temple with enough force to knock him sideways, out of his meditating crisscross position and onto his elbows, face inches away from the ground. Deceit and Virgil both sucked in a breath as Remus froze that way, turned away from them and haphazardly strewn across the path. He raised his head slowly, carefully. Logan felt nothing but vindication at the trickle of blood running down the Duke's temples. Remus met the logical side's eyes with his own, wide and shocked. Then he smiled. "Well done," the Duke breathed, running his tongue across his front teeth with a short, delighted laugh. "Oh, well done indeed, Logan. I should have known you'd be fun. It's always the one you least expect. Lashing out, not what I planned, but oh so very welcomed." He pushed himself back up into a sitting position and cracked his neck. "Throwing things won't wake your little love bug, mind you, but oh my, I'm impressed." Logan glared, fiery still, and shifted Patton in his arms, cradling the moral side's head in the crook of his elbow. "What the hell do you want?" he seethed, heart still racing in his chest because Patton was out and Remus was just unpredictable enough that Logan couldn't know for certain that he'd be awake soon. Remus put his hands up innocently. "I'm only trying to help you, Logan. No need to get irrational. You keep all those feelings locked away in here." He tapped a finger to his own chest, twisting his face into a sharp excuse for a pout as the blood from his temple dripped onto his shoulder. "And that's simply not healthy. You shouldn't repress things, Logan. You shouldn't hide them away and let them rot all alone. You have to let them be known, Logan, and I—" He stopped suddenly, scowl faded and eyes curiously hazy. "And you can't—" He started again, shaking his head a little, but the words came quieter and slower, as if his focus was slipping. He stared at Patton blankly. "Shouldn't let them rot. Alone. And—" He blinked. "Alone." His eyes fell shut just for a moment. When he opened them, they were shining yet shallow, glazed over. He looked like a child whose favorite toy had been taken away, and who now just sat listlessly, waiting for it to be returned so he could continue playing. No one spoke, barely dared to breathe. It was Deceit who finally stepped forward and submitted to the risk of making his existence known in whatever limbo Remus had fallen into so suddenly. His face pinched with something unreadable as he crouched down in front of the Duke and started, voice remarkably soft. "Remus." Remus didn't look up at him, but the thorns stretching out beside the path pulled back into the trees. "You don't need to do this," Deceit continued quietly, a murmured insistence that somehow rose above the deafening silence of the forest, a swirl of sympathy and patience to soften the harsh, dead-end edges of the trees that looked around them. He held a hand out, palm up, and waited. Slowly, surely, Remus lifted his own and placed it on top, gaze flickering over the link like it was a long-lost relic he'd missed so dearly before his eyes fell shut again. Logan heard Virgil release a pent-up breath at his side, where the anxious side had come to crouch. He had a hand curled into the pale blue fabric of Patton's tunic, but the moral side didn't stir. "You're not all alone." Deceit laced their fingers together, and Remus took it in with a breath, small and brief. Logan pulled Patton closer as he watched. He was glad to see the wide-eyed craze of Remus's character had slowed to a sluggish frown, but it didn't change the fact that he was the reason Patton was asleep. And the fact that it hadn't worn off yet made a painful lump form in Logan's throat. "We're willing to talk about this." Remus's eyes flew open. In an instant, he jerked his hand from Deceit's and shoved, pulling himself to a stand as the snake-faced side tumbled back onto his elbows with a shocked yelp, eyes wide as he turned them up to the Duke looming over him. Remus stood straight, his gaze flashed with something dangerously sharp, ready to slice. "No," he said, his voice so low Logan could barely hear it, though the word carried as a threat by itself. "No! Everyone's so willing to talk when they're in the rut they made for themselves," he spat. He turned his eyes on each of them, gaze filled with terrifying clarity as his hands curled into fist. "Willing," he repeated as if it left a bad taste in his mouth. "I'm sure you're willing, but you don't get to offer diplomacy," Deceit finished bleakly. Remus stared down at him again, eyes swimming with a tidal crash of emotions, rough and indistinguishable like the metal scraps in the rapids. "It's not your turn to be willing," he exacted, turning back to face where Logan and Virgil sat with an unconscious Patton and forcing a wide, toothy smile onto his face, discordant with the glassy sheen of his eyes. "You've had years to talk. Now is my turn with the microphone, and I've got quite a lot to say." His gaze flickered to Patton, cradled in Logan's arms. Go on then and solve the problem, Logic. Beat your challenge at last, since I've been so rudely interrupted one too many times. Logan blinked at him, swallowed past the lump in his throat, and looked down at Patton's freckled face that was smooth with sleep. I don't know how. He didn't know, and admitting it made his chest tight, too tight to breathe. All the fire in his veins was quenched as he realized he might fail, right here and now, and Patton of all people. And Remus was staring at him with that smug silence, much more observant and knowing than Logan could shield himself from. What's wrong, Logan? Remus grinned. There was something too sharp about it, something unhinged. Come on now, don't let those icky feelings get in the way. You of all people know how bad that is. You said not to repress. I changed my mind, he interrupted with a twitch of his eye. It's your job, Logan. And now look at you, panicking over the embodiment of what you hate. Pathetic. It was a mixed message that flipped too quickly for Logan to follow. Don't hide your feelings, Logan. Now forget them. It's your job, Logan. And his heart beat too fast in his chest as he looked between Remus and Patton. He should agree with Remus. It was pathetic for him. Logic struggling to breathe and swallow. But the racing in his chest only tugged him to help Patton. Open those bright eyes again, even if he was everything Logan didn't understand. Everything he feared. A kiss, Deceit gasped suddenly. Remus's gaze snapped to his with a sickening crack. Shut it, he hissed, and Deceit reeled back, but Virgil perked up at Logan's side. What? Asked Logan, grimacing as his voice shook. His wrists were shaking too, knuckles white as he held onto Patton like his life depended on it. A kiss, Virgil repeated. He turned to Logan with wide eyes, excited with revelation. Spinning wheels, Sleeping Beauty! It's Rose's favorite. The one with Maleficent and the 3 fairies. I know what it is. What does that have to do with this? Kiss him! Logan blinked. Kiss Patton! Oh. A strange feeling bloomed in Logan's chest, crawling up his throat as he comprehended the suggestion. The racing of his heart seemed to double, threatening to beat out of his chest, and he was almost ready to let it, if only to stop the torrent of feelings eating away at him then. Pressure in his eyes and trembling in his wrists and too much in his mind. Thoughts struggling to keep up with it all and rationalize it away. He wanted to stop. He needed to breathe. Oh. Virgil's relieved smile fell as he watched the logical side. Logan? Look at me. Logan looked, blinking to force back the heat pooling in his eyes. Virgil's gaze was filled with fierce determination. Take a deep breath. I know you're scared, and that's okay, Lo. It sucks not to understand what you're feeling. I get that. He shifted, facing Logan head-on as his voice started to shake just a little. The black half-moons of shadow beneath his eyes had darkened. But you're the most capable person I know. Do you hear me? You can do this. You'll be okay, I promise. His eyes had tears in them, too, Logan realized as the first slipped down his own face. He was crying, but so was Virgil. He let a breath fall to his lungs and out again. Virgil gave him a tiny smile. Everything will be okay. Logan smiled, albeit shakily, at the callback to his own words, which Virgil had clearly held on to. He took another breath and looked down again. Patton's freckles were dark in the shadows of the forest, and though Logan expected to find a reflection of the sky and its ebony hunters in his round glasses, they were free of any such gleam, a clear window to his closed eyes. He was still warm despite the chill when Logan cupped his face with his free hand. You know when you care so much about someone, you do anything to help them when they need it? He leaned down and pressed their lips together. Everything fell silent at once, if only for a moment. Patton smelled like vanilla and peppermint candy, which Logan didn't know he already knew, as the chaos in his mind and body slowed to a still, a sense of calm, of comfort and home filling him instead. He felt the ache of dissipating tension in his wrists as his eyes fell shut. And when he opened them again, when the world inside and outside was quiet, clear blue eyes stared back at him. Patton glanced around as he blinked the sleep from his eyes, startling when Logan gave a shocked, delighted laugh. He stared at the logical side, gaze flickering to his lips and back up as he gave a tiny, albeit confused, smile. Logan. The moral side started slowly, stifling a small laugh as Logan wrapped him in a hug. Oh, this is nice. Never mind, just... He returned the embrace, burying his face in Logan's shoulder. We can just do this for a minute. Where did Remus go? Logan and Patton looked up at Virgil's voice. His eyes scanned the clearing, and when Logan followed suit, he found it a reasonable question, considering the wild-eyed Duke was nowhere to be seen. Deceit was still crouched on the ground where Remus had pushed him, lips pressed tightly together as 3 pairs of eyes landed on him. He just disappeared, he forced out, as if the confession pained him, and he finally pushed himself to a sitting position, face pinched with an unreadable expression. When Virgil was talking, he just turned on his heel and left. The dirt path had a patch of sickly gray where Remus had sat, now empty and pallid against the rest of the ground. Logan didn't enjoy Remus's company, or anything in the realm of positive feelings at all, actually. But the scene felt hollow without his black and gray ensemble to meld with the shadows now. It was as if he'd made himself a part of the picture and torn his presence away suddenly, leaving a jagged tear that made a pit of dread form in Logan's stomach. Silent exit seemed like a bad omen from the histrionic side. The trees moaned with a sudden chill that swept toward them, now bitter and carrying the sure scent of rain. It bit at their faces, seeped through their clothes and pulled at their hair, as if trying to turn them back towards where they started, prodding and prickling until it broke them at last. Logan refused to shiver. Thank you all so much for listening. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss any of my future videos. And if you like what you hear and you want to read more, you can find the link to the fic in the description. See you next time!